and very warm welcome to this first event in Union Chapel of the New Year. So, very welcome and Happy New Year to you all. This is not the first in our series of evenings on climate justice. This is one entitled Climate and Refugees, and we're extremely privileged to have two guest speakers. Courtesy of this amazing technology, we have a speaker from the United Nations University, Dr. Jin-ho Chung, and Dr. Bernardo Bolaños Guerra, who is from the Metropolitan Autonomous University in Mexico City. So that's pretty exciting in my view. And also on the panel, on the screen, we can't see them yet, but we will be able to when their time comes, is my colleague Catherine Crew, who is not in Mexico City or anywhere exciting, but is stuck somewhere in North London, unable to get because of the train strike. But she will be chairing the little panel discussion on Zoom, and we'll have the opportunity to ask questions from here. So that is really something very exciting. We, unfortunately for us, unfortunately for you, we weren't able to find any of our bar staff who were available this evening. So we've put some glasses and some wine out for you, and you're very welcome to have a glass, and, or two, or three. If you get to four, we have got security here, so we're absolutely safe. But what we will do, if it's all right with you, is just tell you that we do have a fund that we've just recently established for our work with asylum seekers in 2 hotels in Islington, and that little fund is for any hardship issues that arise, urgent clothing and so on and so on. So as you leave, you're welcome just to make a little donation, which will go not to the church but to that fund for asylum seekers, which is very appropriate. And if you don't have cash, then there's a barcode that you can twiddle along with and make a donation online. Isn't that clever? Technology is really working for us tonight. But as if those who've been to these evenings before, we like to mix art, culture, music, poetry with talk and discussion. And we begin the evening with some music. Alia Isha and Louis Stigbridge, who are going to do a little set now, and then after the talks and the questions, they'll do a set to follow on. But first of all, please welcome Alia and Lou to the stage. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're just going to do a couple pieces to start with. It's lovely to be here this evening. We weren't 100% sure that we were going to make it because I feel like things are taking everyone down left, right and centre, but we're here. I'm going to start with a song called Wars. Oh, my brothers were killed in your war, and my sisters were raped and left scarred, and my cousin's trying to find his mind still, and my daughter will never be born in a world where we feel no obligation to compassion, recognition of our links, and empowerment of action, love and understanding And my auntie is far too resilient. Yes, her strength is a sign of her suffering. And my papa don't know nothing now for sure. But my dad don't cost him it all. In a world where we feel no obligation to compassion, recognition of our links, and empowerment of action, love and understanding of ourselves and what they call other. I'm talking real dedication, or there ain't nothing left. It's all over. So yeah, this next one is a poem that I wrote, and the next two are kind of like parts A and B written a few months apart. And it's called Peace or Justice, because even though one doesn't exist without the other, it feels that on a daily basis we have to pick between a part of one or the other. Yeah. You keep misunderstanding me. What part of me do you find so threatening? Is it my intelligence, my beauty, my bravery, or my strength to still be kind even when they attack me? How much smaller must I make myself for you not to feel threatened? How much longer must I prove myself before you believe me? How much strength should I ignore? How much truth should I ignore in the name of finding peace? Peace in being misunderstood, peace in being unheard, unseen, peace from within that no outside being can shatter. Yes, I'm working on it. It's grown a lot, no doubt. Each day I'll praise it, I'll feel it. Each day I'll feed it, I'll water it. Sometimes I question it. If this peace I find, we find, despite injustice, just leads to maintaining oppression, perhaps peace is not what we need, but anger, rage to burn it all down. Is my peace like that of a broken horse? Does my peace hold me back or keep me whole? Because I find peace in the pieces of me as I try to piece myself back together, and I find peace in growing and knowing my resilience. But how much more should I train this being able to get back up again when they throw you down? We build a better society. We chose it over burning this one down, because excessive chaos is usually best maneuvered by the powerful and lineal, not by the many and diverse, and those without have suffered enough. See, in those rare instances of history, revolution, humanity had not yet evolved enough to manage its own psychology and create something just, so we have to choose peace, which means turning the other cheek, which means the dilemmas of which I speak, which means holding them accountable, which, to be honest, rarely seems to lead to peace. So I continue, as always, to live between the black and the white, navigating nuance better each time, and I find peace in the pieces of me as I piece myself back together, because balancing between peace and justice is the only space that I can inhabit. Yes, I find peace in the pieces of me, and joy in my power, and somehow gratitude for the tests and the traumas which made me wiser. Yes, I can see love in each breath and wonder in my sight, but I wonder how much cruelty can come with the next sunrise. I'm training peace this time, both inside and out. So I'll trade a part of today's for tomorrow's, full, just, divine. Thank you. And so this one was written a few months afterwards. but kind of about the same topic. And it's called Sprouting Between the Shards. This one I know less well. In my strength, I finally found peace. Sprouting between the shards, the eventual embrace of my resilience, no longer resentful of demand. I watch you all get fazed by shit I've lived so many times worse. Since when did I feel so calm that this shit no longer hurts? Desensitized, dissociating, clearly out of fox. Though some are growing in my garden and I still cultivate bare love and hope and joy and trust. So how did I forget that in those pieces of me lies peace? I literally just didn't clock that in those pieces of me lies my peace. Somehow still so hurt by the shattering that I couldn't see that between those pieces of me remains my peace. And it's those same sharp edges that carve out our paths. Thank you. And now I'm going to join my amazing Loose the Witch. This one's called Reason to Believe. Because, yeah, I think we all need reasons to believe these days. I know no one ever gave you reason to believe, but I am begging you to please try. Because if you don't, how can we expect our brothers and sisters to still survive, stay alive in a state of constant terrorism, yet somehow her strength radiates out past those aneurysms? I know no one ever showed you how powerful you are, or reminded you of your beauty, your strength, and those golden scars which pure wisdom and knowledge and bravery marks. I know you don't remember every day how far you've come, the progress you've made. I know you still hurt and I know you're still lost. Yeah, I know, because I too am trying to find betterness and foster a state of pure love both inside and out, policies of trust and support systems for those without, governing ourselves with compassion and mind, and deep, deep wells in which the soul can find freedom and justice, and explore like the child which lies behind those walls and these constant trials.
Hello, everybody.
To Catherine, who is going to lead the next part of our evening. And Catherine, you know, you can put at the top, you can put the speaker view on from there. So whenever the speaker's on, we just see them.
Yeah. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us, and thank you especially to both our speakers today. We're really pleased to have two excellent speakers on this important topic who have been studying the impact and approaches in climate migration in some different settings. Thank you, Dr. Jin-ho Chung, who is a research fellow at the United Nations University and particularly studying how climate migrants access infrastructure. And his focus has particularly been on the city of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. So really interested to hear that perspective as well. I'm also really pleased to be joined by Dr. Bernardo Bolaños, who is a professor of environmental law in Metropolitan Autonomous University in Mexico City and a visiting professor at the University of Toronto. And he's been particularly studying migration induced by environmental causes in the Americas. So I'm so interested to hear your different approaches on this issue. So if I could ask Dr. Jin-ho Chung, if you'd like to speak first.
Thank you for the introduction. Let me share the screen. Can you see the screen? Yeah. Great. So thank you. Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to the interview, to the event. And I'm Jin-ho, originally from South Korea, and currently working for the United Nations University Center for Policy Research in New York as a research fellow. I understand that in the previous seminars, you had a chance to understand how colonialism and power of large companies worsen the climate emergency around the globe. So today, my topic is quite in line with those seminars because Ethiopia is known for its authoritarian government with a history of internal colonialism, while facing increasingly severe level of drought. So I'm currently looking into how climate change in rural Ethiopia shaped the migration patterns of different social groups and the proposition of moving to cities over other options through online interviews with practitioners and policymakers and academics in Ethiopia. The reason that I conducted online interviews instead of going to the field is because of as we all know, the pandemic and the civil war took place in Ethiopia between November 2020 and November 2022. Luckily, it's ended. So finally, I'm very much looking forward to visiting Ethiopia, conducting the fieldwork this year. So climate migration refers to both voluntary and involuntary multidirectional movement of people, including an act of not moving for reasons related to climate change. The popularity of the term climate migration reflects a progression towards interpretations of climate response better tuned to structural inequalities, social and economic precarity, and political event. In other words, climate migrants don't necessarily only refer to people directly affected and subsequently relocated by fast onset climate change, such as hurricane or flood. They also include people who are affected by slow onset climate change, such as increasingly frequent and intense level of drought. And they go through multiple decision-making processes of whether, when, and where to move at household or individual levels. For this reason, climate change and its relationship to migration have been of interest to researchers and policymakers for more than 25 years, with migration often represented either as successful livelihood diversification or as a lack of capacity to adopt in situ. So Ethiopia is an interesting site to study climate migration for several reasons. Firstly, in this landlocked country, due to the wide range of altitude from minus 197 meter to up to 4,550 meter, topography, habitat, climate, population distribution, and livelihood are all really closely linked to each other. And also Ethiopia is the second largest populated country in Africa, estimated at 115 million of population. More than 40% of the population is still under the age of 15, and almost 30% is aged between 15 and 29. So it's relatively really young country. And the majority of the country's population live at an altitude of between 2,000 and 4,500 meters, as you can see from the population density level. In this highland, people mostly rely on rain-fed, small-scale farming systems with a tropical monsoon climate. In lower elevation, which is the mostly eastern and southern part of the country, which is less densely populated with less rainfall, people are mainly depends on herding, pastoralism. Ethiopia is still predominantly rural, but with one of the fastest urbanization rate of about 5% a year and double-digit annual GDP growth. Ethiopia is a country with increasingly frequent and intense drought event, dominated by the extreme level of drought. Although the rainy season is different by region, it is generally considered that the main rainy season, known as cramped in Amharic, is from August to October. And the short rainy season, known as Belg, is from March to June. The Belg rain is often unreliable, but it's a very critical factor in agriculture, and because many kinds of grains are planted during this period. Most Ethiopians' perception of drought refers to the absence or delay of the Belg rains. According to the recent research, the projected drought result shows a general increase in drought conditions in Ethiopia throughout the 21st century. Particularly, the projected drought months shows that April and May are likely to show the highest increase in drought occurrence during this period. The spring season is associated with the Belg rain, as explained, which are critical in the Ethiopian agricultural systems. It is also important to understand that climate migration is not something new in Ethiopia. Firstly, there was a government-led large-scale resettlement and villagization programs in the 80s. The program initially aimed to restructure land use patterns and social services to improve agricultural productivity against repeated drought by moving people to new villages from the overcrowded northern highland of Ethiopia. However, after all, the program was used as a calculated attempt to break the insurgency movement by depriving the rebel groups of their popular base of support, strengthening the domestic security and enhancing political control over rural areas of Ethiopia. It focused on relocating people from the cool and dry northern highland where the insurgency movement was severe, to the hot and wet lowland. As a result, almost 600,000 people were relocated during the 80s, but due to the limited consultation and harsh environment and lack of adequate facilities, more than 5% of the settlers died from starvation and tropical disease, and almost 15% left the new settlement. And secondly, there has been a series of voluntary movement to large-scale farms in the western part of Ethiopia, mostly funded by Chinese and Indian companies, started in the late 90s. It was the Ethiopian government hosted those companies for the investment in commercial agriculture. These farming sites were popular destinations for young male farmers who can seasonally migrate to those large-scale farms for several months of work, mostly during the off-farm season, which is between November till February, which is a dry season, and there is no much farm work. And they are mostly from the northern highland of Ethiopia. However, after the severe drought in 2011 and 2012, these destinations became less popular. Firstly, because the farm was quite extractive of the environment, because it was run during the dry season and used a lot of water, mostly sugarcane farms, and it was really vulnerable to drought. But secondly, those temporary migrants realized that there is limited off-farm opportunities in those regions when there is poor harvest as a result of drought. So they couldn't find any other job opportunities in this region. So as a result, people are now heading to cities in Ethiopia instead of large-scale farms in rural areas during the off-farm season. So their migration is temporary. The migration to large-scale farms have been affected by climate change and a series of ethnic conflict, including the recent civil war in northern Ethiopia. A number of interviewees explained that how ethnic conflict have transformed the existing rural-to-rural migration patterns. Currently, the most popular destination for internal migrant is Addis Ababa, the country's capital, which is a melting pot of diverse ethnic groups. Ethiopia has more than 80 ethnic groups and more than 80 ethnic-based languages. So it is really obvious if you are in different region that you are a stranger. Moving to Addis Ababa is seen as a lower risk option than moving to other regional cities or previously popular large-scale farms. Migrants tend to avoid regions where they are obviously seen as outsiders, and this trend has become more prominent due to the country's recent civil war. Agriculture in Ethiopia is becoming a risky business. This is because all land has been nationalized over the last 200 years, and land tenure systems are strictly controlled by government, while facing increasingly unreliable spring rainfall that affecting farming productivity. Access to land is crucial for the livelihood of smallholder farmers. Ethiopia still has a preliminary agrarian economy. One of the major challenges faced by the country is a rising number of the landless youth in rural areas. Land scarcity is chronic in Ethiopia. Over the last 30 years, the population has more than doubled from 50 million to more than 115 million. Population density is also growing rapidly, leading farm size per household to dwindle. More than half of rural farming households in Ethiopia currently cultivate less than 1 hectare of land. For access to land in Ethiopia, because all land is nationalized, youth historically rely on land inheritance only. Individual land users have the legal right to transfer usufruct right to their children or other blood-related family members. Individuals can also rent their land to usufruct right to any persons, but with very strict restrictions on size and duration. So population pressure has reduced arable land, the cultivatable land availability and employment opportunity for youth in agriculture. In addition to climate change, pessimistic views on land inheritance prospect have encouraged youth to leave their home village for non-agriculture income activities or for further education in cities. Moreover, although land inheritance and tenure policies in Ethiopia apply to all citizens, customary norms and practices generally favor men over women. This is because marriage in rural Ethiopia is primarily patriarchal, and sons typically take care of their parents in old age. In this context, a decision for females to migrate to urban areas is quite affected by their marriage status, because if they're married, their mobility is severely restricted. But I understand this topic to be discussed in your next seminar. So I'll move to the more, I'm focusing on males in my research. Meanwhile, as I said, all land in Ethiopia is banned for sale because it's nationalized. It discourages people from migrating permanently if they own any size of land, even this is very small land, because they can't sell. And then they encourage them to leave their family members behind, mostly wives and children, to look after the property. This pattern of temporary migration, mostly between November and February, caused a lot of burden on city infrastructure for both migrant and policymakers. Because those migrants are non-skilled and they move to cities temporarily just for a few months, and as a result, they often work at the construction site or as a guard for the buildings, and they often stay in slums with a harsh environment, with much worse living conditions compared to their home in rural villages. Sanitation, access to water, and toilets are really limited, and often more than 12 people live together in a very small room. Also, it's for policymakers, because this is a temporary migration, it's really hard to predict how many people will come to cities from when to when. I mean, although they know vaguely they are moving during the winter, but they don't know whether they're going to stay permanently, they're going to go back to their home. So policymakers, it's really hard job for policymakers to plan ahead in terms of city infrastructure. So, as a conclusion, climate migration in Ethiopia is not only about climate change. Climate change affects human migration mostly indirectly via its impact on other social, economic, and political drivers and circumstances that collectively affect human migration. Climate migration is not something new in Ethiopia. It has been often entangled with the country's social and political agenda and economic development. There is a dominance of rural to urban migration of young males in Ethiopia. Migration is mostly internal, domestic, which is quite different from our common perception of international migration from the global south to the global north. This is mostly temporary, and they leave their family behind. These changes in migration patterns in Ethiopia has a significant implication for urban policies in the coming years. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Jin-ho. That was really interesting. And it's so important to hear that it's not just about the climate by itself, but it's about politics and power and how they influence our response to the climate, which is something we've been thinking about throughout this series. And I'm really interested to come to Bernardo now, because I know you've been studying environmental law, so particularly hearing about the role of law there as well, and more international migration too. So Bernardo, thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me and sharing with me the music, the poetry, the presentation of my colleague. I have some problems with but I will try to solve it now. Well, I prepared some slides, but now they are not here. Let's see. Can you see them now?
I can't.
You can't. Okay. I will do it again. Share slides. Is not now?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I will present some results of my research on migration from Central America and displacement, climate displacement, that we will see is a different concept, even though, as Jin-ho Chung was explaining, we can also use the notion of migration as something that is not necessarily linked to actual movement, but potential movement or voluntary movement, because it can be also involuntary movement. However, we have another word for that, and that's very important in environmental law. The word is displacement instead of migration. And forced displacement is important because in international law, the duties of countries toward displaced people are different from the duties toward migrants that voluntarily try to adapt to climate change. So let's start showing a map by the IPCC, because I will stress, I will make put the accent on the fact that I tried to do, as well as Jin-ho, evidence-based research. We can be here motivated by emotions, moral emotions like solidarity, compassion, but it is very important to make it clear that science is behind the idea of environmental migration. This map is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of the United Nations. Its job, you know, is to advance scientific knowledge about climate change caused by human activities. And as you can see, Latin America is from Mexico to Brazil, threatened by droughts. So it's not a speculation, it's not an indirect phenomenon, but something that I would I like to present as something more direct. And in order to make this kind of claim, I will also read some testimonies. For example, from a Guatemalan migrant. They are the most simplified testimonies because it is very difficult in a talk to reconstruct what the interviews present, very complex cases, personal cases, persons who have a complex history. But I have a selection of some that are very useful. I will read. The rainy season no longer comes when we expect it. And if it doesn't rain, the cornfield doesn't grow and it can't be cultivated. What I did was cultivate what I could and leave the field to my wife so that the family could live until the next year that I plan to come back. What I hope is to get a job in the United States and send money to pay the debt and then return. I never thought I was going to leave, even if I were very poor. You don't want to die from your land, far from your land, sorry. So take into account that rainy season no longer comes when peasants and agricultural workers expect it. We have also rapid phenomena, not only slow phenomena like drought. And recently in 2020, November 2020, two big hurricanes hit Central America. And ETA and Iota produced millions of affected persons and maybe 1.7 million migrants. So it's an important recent meteorological phenomena that produce forced displaced people. And for example, in the Toronto Star, I just found a testimony that it is also easy to present today. All our problems started with the hurricanes, is what says Ana Morazan from Honduras. And since leaving Honduras, she was attacked by gangs in Central America and kidnapped in Mexico. You can read the article, and I will quote the article by Julie Watson, a journalist. Now she and Freddy Juarez are among tens of thousands of Central Americans in Mexican border cities seeking to request asylum in the US. Fear of violence keeps them from trying to return to Honduras. Even if they did go back, they would have no place to live. If ETA and Iota had not hit, it would not have started a chain reaction of other things that forced them to flee. I am a lawyer, and however, I have some interviews by my team, by myself and my team. I cannot present many of them because there is entanglement in Mexico between violence by the narco-traffic and vulnerability by climate change. But I interviewed a woman who repeated the same words almost than the Honduran woman, saying everything started with the hurricanes Ingrid and Manuel in 2013. Afterwards, my son had to go to the United States and I was alone. So they, the mob, the mafia, the narcos, came and now I am displaced in Chilpancingo and they have my home. So this is the way in which we have to understand environmental migration in Central America and Mexico, Colombia, and the Caribbean. The violence is frequently something that happens afterwards. When vulnerability is so clear, so difficult to handle, that people is not resilient anymore. It has been recognized by the own American government. The President Joe Biden asked to the agencies of intelligence to make an assessment of climate change and migration and social problems in the world related to it. And as you can see, Central America is a region that is of concern when the United States think about their security. I use this map because if they recognize it, that Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti, even Colombia are countries of concern because of climate change and the migration that can lead from those countries, we don't need to prove anymore that climate change is a reality. And it's not, for me, an indirect and side reality, but something that is more direct. We have also a very complex, but at the same time, very clear link with climate change, that is the destruction of coffee production. Again, I will present a testimony. At 50 years old, Don Jacinto left Honduras with only a small backpack and his distinctive straw. He used to grow coffee in the western department of Copan, but increasing debts and the spread of a fungus that ravaged his crops forced him to sell his land. Left with no property, income, or savings to sustain his family, he headed north in search of employment. It is part of an article by Maria Jose Mendez, a Honduran scholar in Toronto. Why coffee is so vulnerable to climate change? Well, in fact, it is vulnerable to heat because it is grown in cloud forests that are not very, very warm. I mean, cloud forest, where you can find quetzals, like the bird that you see there, are changing, are disappearing from Central America. Of course, it is possible to cultivate banana where you cultivated coffee before, but the transition is not easy, and the prices and the market displace people from their homes. I want to represent those movements of people with this map, showing the main causes of environmental and climate migration from Central America. In 2012, in Guatemala, a crisis in the coffee production expelled many migrants, as well as in 1998 and in 2020, hurricanes, the Hurricane Mitch, expelling 1.5 million people. And in 2020, as we were saying, the hurricanes Eta and Iota expelled 1.7 million migrants, not only internationally, but also interregionally among the countries of Central America. And we were talking at the beginning about drought, and there is a dry corridor in Central America that you can see in orange color. In 2010 and between 2014 and 2015, huge droughts expelled also many migrants. The Mexican government considers that half of the migrants, Central American migrants, arriving to Mexico now are from the dry corridor of Central America. Talking about legal issues, we can say that displacement is not migration. At least is not migration in a strict sense, or in treaties, international treaties, it is considered a different concept. Displacement is the movement of people who have been forced or compelled to escape or flee their home or place of habitual residence, in particular as a result of the effects of an armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural catastrophes, also man-made catastrophes. That's a definition by the International Organization for Migration. Migration is the movement of people away from their usual place of residence, either across an international border or within a country. And also, as a legal conclusion, as at the point of view of legal scholars and legal specialists, there are no climate refugees, because refugee is someone who is outside their country of origin for reasons of feared persecution, conflict, or generalized violence, according to the Geneva Convention. So what we need is the recognition, the legal recognition of forced, displaced people that was displaced or were displaced by climate change. Finally, I will present to you something that is related to the idea of colonialism, but colonialism in science. I and some other colleagues in Mexico, we developed this diagram showing the flows of migrants from Central America to other countries. And it is systematically rejected by Northern scholars as something that is not enough big. It's big data, but not enough big. And they say you need statistics that are more, with more information. And it is very difficult when you work in a poor country to have that kind of information. So it's like, I was going to say in Spanish, we use the word Via Crucis, the way of the cross. I hope you are not offended, but it's the way of, is the idea of something very difficult to accomplish coming from a poor country that has no enough census and not enough information available to prove, for example, that that country has displaced, climate displaced people. But I think that I show you that it is clear, since the science of the IPCC to the recognition of the American government, that Central America is suffering from of climate change. And my conclusions are the following. Extreme events directly affect migratory flows, and they forcibly displace people. Migration is sometimes a strategy to adapt. However, forced displacement due to climate change is not adaptation, it's forced displacement. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernardo. That was really interesting to see a different side to this effect of the climate for people who have to move internationally. It was also interesting to see some of the similarities that were existing with both of you talking about livelihoods changing and how that affects where people need to go. And I hope everyone sitting in the audience is busy thinking of the questions that they would like to ask, because we'll be coming to the Q&A in just a moment. In fact, I think I see someone coming up there with a microphone.
Yep. Hi, everybody. And another round of applause for our speakers who are doing quite incredible tonight. And does anybody have any questions for either of tonight's speakers?
Hi. Well, first, thanks for those talks, which were really illuminating and also very worrying. One of the things which I'm curious about is whether these patterns of migration or displacement, how well they fit with the model of the nation states, of which, you know, since seeing as, you know, a lot of Central America is nowadays made up of nation states, and how are these migration patterns, you know, compelling people to cross borders and feel, you know, have violence inflicted on them when they arrive where they want to go, or you know, that sort of thing.
Did we catch that, Dr. Jin-ho and Dr. Bolaños? Did we catch the question? Does anybody want to answer? Jin-ho, would you like to go first?
Probably it's better for Bernardo to answer first, because it's addressing Central America, but then I will also add from my perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a very good question, because of course nation states are controlling migration. Borders are militarized, and that's because states have the power to do it. However, people look for a place to survive, and as we saw in the first talk, there are traditions of migration in Ethiopia, in Central America, for generations. People know where to go, and it's not always inside their countries. We have to say that most of the environmental migration is internal to each country. International migration is not the huge part of it. Migration caused by climate change is mostly inside countries. However, it is important to start of recognizing that sometimes it is not possible to stay. For example, in Central America, youth gangs, make it difficult for some migrants, some displaced people to stay in their countries. So we need some more open borders in order to protect those migrants. So I don't know if that answer is enough, but it is clear that we have to start recognizing, as well as refugees, climate forced displaced persons, because if we recognize it, people in each country, the public opinion will start to accept the fact that climate change is real and that we need to be, we need solidarity, we need reciprocity, we need compassion toward them, and it is important to recognize international migration caused by climate change.
Yeah, thank you, Bernardo. Yeah, it is true that, I mean, we, with the researchers in the University of Oxford, we have recently conducted a systematic review of literature covering the topic of climate migration last year. Systematic review is kind of the literature review covering all the literature published in a certain topic. So we have covered more than 1,000 literature and policy papers in this topic, and we found that actually more than half of the document were addressing the issue of internal migration rather than international migration affected by climate change. So it is quite proof that actually people are migrating internally if their livelihood is affected by climate change. That's the first thing to mention. And then secondly, in the case of Ethiopia, Ethiopia has more than 80 ethnic groups, as I explained, and then they have a history of internal colonialism. So even within Ethiopia, it is when they migrate, they feel like they are migrating to another country. So if their migration is affected by slow onset climate change, like a drought, not flood or hurricane, so if they can still make a decision to migrate or not, they would really hesitate to go to another regions because it is a big decision, and then they often need to leave their families behind. So when it comes to nation state, sometimes it is quite difficult to apply how you make the decision of migration. But also I want to separately mention that actually I wanted to mention during the presentation, but I didn't, is what is there is the fund called the European Union Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. It was they call EU Emergency Trust Fund, so EUTF, and Ethiopia is the third top recipient of this fund and received more than 300 million euro over the last 6 years to reduce the arrival of migrants and refugees in Europe. So, and this fund was really focusing on restricting the migration and mobility of people in Ethiopia so that they don't come to Europe or to the other global north. And then, but in terms of climate change, we found that actually people are not migrating internationally, at least in the Horn of Africa. So this fund was quite controversial and harshly criticized by academics and policymakers in the region. Yep.
I've got a question over here, so I'll go to her first. And then here.
Hello, everybody, and both of you on the speakers. I'm very confused why you are both specializing in men as migrants, and perhaps it is a bit muddled in my brain, but I understood that many women grew food at home and would be able to do so, but you seem to be talking about cash crops, and when they fail, people then migrate. And you say people, but I think you mean mostly men.
Yes, that's also one of the issues that I need to address in my research. Firstly, I mean, the reason that I started focusing on male at first place was because I've been working on research topics in Ethiopia with the climate change, and also I'm quite ethnographic researcher, so I go to the villages and I interview people, and that's what I did over the last almost 10 years. But as a man, it is not always easy to talk to women in rural villages. So there was a bit of restriction at my individual level. So that was one of the reasons personally. But the main reason is because it's very traditionally it's a very traditional society, and the women, if they're married, they often stay behind for the farming work or the work in a household, and the male are the one who actively migrate to other regions to find additional income opportunities. But as I briefly mentioned during the presentation, unmarried women, especially the teenage girls, it is quite common these days that they are migrating to cities for two reasons. Because firstly, they want to escape from the traditional society in rural village and to get education opportunities in cities probably available. And secondly, Ethiopia has a housemaid culture, and for women, it's quite easy to find a job in cities as a housemaid. Actually, that's in terms of job security, I found from the interviews that actually women's job security as a housemaid is much higher compared to men who work as a non-skilled labor at the construction site. So women's migration definitely is a kind of issue that we need to do further research. And that will be actually part of my future research this year.
I could only say that it is true, it's a very important subject. Women are more vulnerable to storms because sometimes in traditional societies they don't know how to swim because they were not taught how to swim, they were not trained, and they are victims of natural disasters in a proportion more important than men. That's why it's important that in the funds, green funds that try to help to adapt and to help displaced persons, displaced people in everywhere in the world, women have to have a priority. It is important to change mentalities, but also because they are more affected by climate change. So it's a very important subject. And no, I am using the word people also for men or for women, because when they stay, they are very important for the survival of the communities that stay home, even though sometimes men go abroad to work in a proportion that is more important, but is not exclusive. There are, of course, also women that are migrating abroad to help their communities. And in Mexico, it has an important consequence. That is that children are sometimes alone or with their grandparents, because, of course, women are also migrating.
I'd just like to say as well that I hope you'll be able to join us for our next session, where we are particularly looking at the issues surrounding women and their vulnerability to climate change, which is on the 1st of February, with a wonderful Pan-African feminist activist.
It will be good, I promise. I'm going to pass over for our next question.
Thank you. This is a question for Dr. Bolaños. I know that over a long period of time there's been a discussion around the inappropriateness of the term climate change refugee and the interaction between the question of the Geneva Convention and people who are displaced because of climate change. Did I understand you to be proposing some sort of international law or definition which would be binding on states in the way that the Geneva Convention is to its signatories? And what is the current situation internationally, particularly at United Nations levels, towards getting some sort of international treaty understanding? I'm not sure what the correct term would be for a legal definition of a displaced person because of climate change.
Thank you very much. It's a great question. It's a subject of it's a very important subject today. Agencies like the Agency for Refugees of the United Nations claims that refugee is a good category that can be used to protect climate displaced people. They say that there is always violence involved or some kind of persecution, and that it is possible to use that concept. However, the other organizations are claiming that it is not enough, and sometimes there is no violence, there is no persecution, and there is no way to protect displaced people using the Geneva Convention. The problem is that to renegotiate the Geneva Convention is almost impossible, because countries like Russia would leave the Geneva Convention because, for example, they are claiming that they won't accept climate migrants from the south, from the Indian subcontinent. So they are not ready to modify, to enlarge the definition of refugee. Another strategy would be to use the treaties, the Paris Agreement, and all the treaties on climate change to ask countries to help people to adapt, receiving them. So we have three strategies: to enlarge the definition of refugee, to create a new category of forced displaced person, displaced by climate change or another environmental reason. And the third one is to use duties of cooperation to help people to adapt to climate change. I think that we have to try every strategy. I don't think that one of them is better than the other, because that depends on geopolitical circumstances. But there will be millions of people without protection. So maybe the three are worth exploring.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you to both the speakers. And so I have one. Is there enough time for 2 questions? Okay. So one question each for both of our speakers. And my question to Dr. Bernardo actually builds on the previous question, because I mean, as both of you have mentioned, climate change manifests itself in very different ways. Like, it can manifest as a freak weather event, as well as something that happens over a much longer period of time. And I'm wondering the extent to which we can have one category in international law that will somehow cover people that are affected by a hurricane and have lost their lands, as well as people that are having to move because their land has become not farmable over many, many years or many decades. Like, is it really possible to cover both types of migration under one legal category? And my question for Dr. Jin-ho is, a lot of the sorts of migration patterns that you described, both in terms of rural to urban migration, but also temporary migration, they seem to be quite characteristic of industrializing nations in general. I grew up in Delhi, and I know that this is very much quite characteristic of what migration internally in India looks like. So I was just wondering exactly how climate change changes this pattern, which probably would have existed in Ethiopia regardless, given as it is a developing, industrializing country. Yeah.
Well, concerning the question to me, it could be possible to have one category, but we would need a new convention on the rights of environmental migrants and displaced persons. As you have to think about the rights of children, for example, there is a convention for the rights of children, human rights, but specifically children, we need the same for environmental migrants and displaced persons. But it is very difficult to launch that kind of, only if the United Nations suddenly, after a new catastrophe, like it was, the Geneva Convention was approved after the Second World War, it would be the same. Maybe if all the countries are moved by a tragedy, they would accept a new convention. Otherwise, it wouldn't be enough, only one category.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So kind of in terms of, because I'm academic researcher, and in terms of academic research approach, we see that instead of migration kind of forming as a direct response to climate change or environmental issues, we see that there are non-environmental issues also considered to be quite important, because they all together generate different barriers or opportunities for migrants in terms of when and whether they're going to move, especially when it comes to slow onset climate change. Of course, when it comes to hurricane or flood, it displaces people immediately, and also that affect another issues. But when it comes to like a gradually increasing level of drought, for example, people will have opportunities to make a decisions. So in the previous academic approach, they used to make a simple link between a drought and migration. But these days, also people are considering how people make a decision at different level, at even, for example, at household, even at individual level. So obviously, it is quite, for me, difficult to understand climate migration apart from the fact that Ethiopia is a developing country, and then a lot of people are actually migrating to cities, regardless of climate change. So it is also kind of a challenge that we need to address, that because it is sometimes really difficult to distinguish in cities whether they are climate migrant or not. So it is also that issue we are currently investigating in collaboration with IOM. So that is kind of my answer to your question, if I answered correctly.
Thank you very much. We only have time for one more question. If anybody has a question, if not, no? No? Okay. Well, I'll hand back over to Alia and Lou, who will be doing their next set. And thank you to the speakers. Thank you. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Catherine, my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you.